Hi guys, Alec Peirce Scuba, Vintage Scuba again. If you're into vintage stuff, or you're a vintage guy like me, whatever, if you're into vintage scuba, this is the place for you. Now, we've had a couple of camera underwater photography episodes because it's a big deal, underwater photography. Everybody tries underwater photography. Some people are successful. I'm trying to think of a couple. No, there are some people are very successful, but very, very few. Underwater photography doesn't depend on the equipment. I have some friends, some good divers and so on, and they have spent thousands, literally thousands, $10, $15, $20,000 is not unlikely at all, and with me at the store that I used to own. And I thought they were wonderful people who were spending all that money. The pictures were crap. And other people would have a really nice, decent little underwater camera, underwater housing and camera and flash, and they knew a bit about photography, but they had an eye, and they would see something, and they'd get the right angle, got a great picture. Really hard to explain, but some people are good photographers, and some people take pictures. There's a big difference. However, we talked about the Aqua Eye, plastic bag with piece of glass production, and that was pretty neat a while ago, 10 bucks. Got you into underwater photography back in the 60s, 50s and 60s. Okay, so let's talk about some vintage underwater photographic equipment. We already talked about the Aqua Eye, and then I had an episode just recently about homemade, vintage, homemade underwater cameras and housings, and I think some of you have seen that and enjoyed it. But you know, at the same time, just because there was homemade stuff that you could build yourself, there were production cameras and housings. If you looked in any catalog, even going back as far back as the late 50s and certainly the 60s and into the 70s, there were lots and lots of underwater cameras and housings available. So it's not that they weren't available, it's just that they were expensive. They really were quite expensive for people of those days anyway, and you could build it yourself, so why not? But let me show you a couple of old and very interesting underwater camera and housing combinations that were available to be purchased from those days. Let me give an example, okay? Here's one example right here. I'm going to take this one. It's kind of a special one to me. This was given to me by a very good friend of mine in Catalina Island. Bob Kennedy, Catalina Island. Some of you may know Bob Kennedy from Catalina Island. We dove with him many times. Had some wonderful experiences with him. I think I just heard recently that he's no longer in the business, that he's got rid of his dive shop down there. I'm not too sure if that's the case, but he was a lot of fun. We had a good time with him. And he had this camera housing in his dive shop there, Scuba Love. I remember, that's amazing. And I looked at it many times, and he knew me, and he knew I was into vintage equipment and so on. I don't know if he knew that my nickname was Sea Hunter. That's just an informal nickname that I use as ID, and some people know me as that, partly because of my sea hunt collection. Anyway, this particular camera housing is the Sea Hunter. I don't know if you can see that there, Kevin. It's called the Sea Hunter. So every time we were down there in Catalina diving in the wonderful kelp voice, great diving. If you've not dived there, try it. And then I would see this and I would say, that's nice. I said to Bob, no, don't you ever sell that. If you ever decide that you want to get rid of some of this vintage equipment, that camera housing there with Sea Hunter on it, you know, that's my nickname. I want that. I'll buy that from you. Anyway, we were down there on one of our trips and had a great time as usual with Bob getting ready to go, and he handed it to me. Very special. So this camera housing means a lot to me, and it's a good example of what was available. It's very heavy. I'm going to guess that this weighs 5 pounds for sure, maybe more than that. That's the camera. There's a small camera inside. I think it's a Color-Matic, just an inexpensive 35 millimeter, no, 120 film, simple camera. Goes into this housing. So if you had that particular camera model, then you could buy this housing. And the housing is quite expensive. It's made of aluminum, which was expensive in those days. And I want to show you just quickly the back here, because in those days, in the late 50s, early 60s, we didn't have decent O-rings or decent controls or any of that kind of stuff. So in order to get this to seal, what they used really was just a piece of rubber, a flat piece of rubber. And it's like a head gasket on a car, for gosh sakes. And the little camera sat in there, and you close it up, and you put on the wing nuts, and jammed it down nice and tightly, and prayed. And often what we would do in those days, and when we built a new camera housing, and for the first time we would take it into a pool, and we wouldn't put the camera in it, and put a weight in it, and then take it down 10 feet, 20 feet, maybe 30 feet. If it didn't leak at 30 feet, then pretty much it wasn't going to leak at all. You get deeper than 30 feet, the pressure would seal it really well. But this is pretty typical, heavy. You see it's also got almost like scope sights on the back of a crosshair. So you look through here and you look through there and you see the cross. Then you know that your camera's pointing right at your subject because there's no viewfinder. This is not like a digital camera, folks, where you see on the back what the camera's looking at. No, you had to guess. You had to guess the distance, and you could adjust the distance on here. You had to guess the amount of light, and you would adjust the exposure on here and so on. And finally, when you thought, gee, I think I got it all together, then you press the trigger, and you might get a good picture. In fact, what we used to do in those days, if it was something we wanted to get a picture of for sure, we would take 3 pictures. We'd maybe change the f-stop a little wee bit and take a picture, and then write on what we thought it was, and then a third one going the other way, and hopefully out of the 3 we got one good picture. And you had to guess it to focus. We got pretty good at that. If the fish is 3 feet away or 7 feet away made a big difference. I got a lot of wonderful slides of incredibly good fish that are fuzzy. So it's a lot of guesswork involved, but it was a lot of fun. Now here's another example here. Now, if you had a little more money, if you were into photography a bit more, then maybe you had one of these excellent cameras. This is an Argus. Probably, I don't know if Argus is even still around, but they made fantastic equipment, photographic equipment in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And this was called the Color-Matic. And it came, and when you bought this camera, it came, and this was quite common, this kind of case. Head strap hung around your neck. Want to take a picture, you flip the front down, you take a picture, you see. When you protect it, you put it back up. Well, if you had one of these wonderful cameras and you were a diver and you wanted to go underwater, well, you could take your Argus Color-Matic camera, you see, and that's all ready to go. And then you would go to your local dive store or maybe a specialist store, and you would buy one of these Seahawk camera housings. Now look at, isn't that gorgeous? This is all cast aluminum as well. See, and American made camera and housing, American made, and just beautiful. So you would buy this housing to fit your Color-Matic Argus camera, and you take off these thumb screws in the back, take off the back cover. Look at that. Ooh. Hear that? Oh boy, that's a housing and a half. And then there's a big thick rubber washer in here. The thicker it is, the more compresses, the better the seal, right? I think that's the way we used to think anyway. So you take that out of there, preferably without tearing the holes too much. You get that out of there like that, get that off of there, like so. And there's the inside of the camera, and they were always painted a dull black on the inside, so you got no reflections. And you move the levers out of the way, and then you would take your Argus and snap it shut, like so. And you set the Argus carefully into the camera, like so, just right. And you see that the lever, yep, that works. And then you have to, yep, that works just fine. And put it all back together. I won't bother putting the cover, the gasket in. Put the gasket on, and then put the cover on. And then you screw this down really, really tightly. Squeeze that rubber as hard as you can. Even then, there was no guarantee. As I say, the first few dives, you look very carefully. We had no water sensor. You watch very carefully to see if any water got in there. And think, okay, that's pretty good. Off you go, doing some underwater photography. No weight belt. Not with this in your hands anyway. And it was great. Off you go. You see something and you're guessing again. This one you can't see it very well. This has what we would call iron sights. You see the little, can you get in closer, Kev? Can you see that little slot right there? Right there? You see the pin in front? It's like shooting an old single shot 22 with buckhorn sights. You put the pin in the middle of the slot on your subject and you squeeze your trigger. Just that simple. Did you see that? I'm sorry. Yep. You got it? And then you would rotate the film to the next film, to the next film, and you're all set to go. A couple other buttons on there. I'm not sure what they're for. I think there was actually some focus adjustment on here. So you could turn this and adjust the focus. Yeah, his lens is turning. So, you can adjust it. So there's another example of a beautiful, beautiful underwater camera, in this case, and housing. Camera was made by Argus, and the housing by Seahawk. And these were expensive in those days. I would guess that these cameras and housings were in the area of about $150. Doesn't sound like very much, does it? Can't buy a tire for my truck for anywhere near that. But that was a lot of money back then. That would be, well, people were working for $35 a week. Lots of people, 40, 50, let's say $50 a week is well paid. It's 3 weeks work full-time, every penny you made to get one of those housings. That was very expensive. We could build one for $20. You saw my episode on homemade housings. But they were beautiful. Today, what's that housing worth? Let's say $150 in 1960. Today, that housing, $500. maybe $600 in that area. It all depends if somebody is really into underwater photography, a collector, into vintage underwater photography, and then they see this beautiful combination of the Argus and that, they might pay a lot more than that for it. But I would guess somewhere in that area. Now, if you didn't have that kind of money, there were less expensive production housings available. A company called Ikelite. I think you've all heard of Ikelite. Did you know that Ikelite was owned by a company, started by a chap called Ike? Yeah. And they made the first really good underwater light. And everybody loved it. And they called it Ike's Light. Ikelite is still around 50 years later. Now they still make lights, excellent lights, but they have graduated more into underwater photography, and they make housings for almost every camera available. If you have a camera today, video camera, whatever camera, digital, whatever you have, and you would like to go underwater with it, look up Ikelite, Ikelite. Look up Ikelite. Punch in your camera, make a model, and there's a camera housing for you. And this is one of their very early production cameras, old-fashioned twist locks on the side. They're much better today. Lever on the front and adjustments on there, and very, very simple camera. You can see how you can wind the film at the back. So this is and these were much cheaper in those days. You could probably get this for $50. A lot more than that now, but there's an example. I want to show you one more camera in housing that's very special, and this is a very common, I mean very common, but most vintage divers and certainly vintage underwater photographers have heard about the Nemrod Siluro because it's quite famous, and it is not an expensive unit particularly, less than $100 when it was new in the 60s, late 60s, but it was kind of interesting because it's like the Nikonus. If any of you if you know what the word Nikonus is, hear Nikonus, you know we're talking about an amphibious camera. So this, I don't want that to fall off of there. This is a Nemrod Siluro. I'm handling this with some care, and I'll tell you why. Not that the camera itself is overly fragile. It's just that this particular Nemrod Siluro was brand new, brand spanking new, never been wet. It's been out of the box twice, including today. And so this is it. And the interesting thing about this is a camera. That's right. It's not a camera in a housing. This is a camera. It's an amphibious camera. So it's very, very simple. I'm just going to see if I can do this, Kevin. If you just bear with me for 1 second. You see there's 4 clips on it. And if I'm lucky, no, I'm not going to struggle with it. It pops apart. There's an O-ring. And so these 2 halves come apart. And when you pop it apart, and you open up, the whole back lifts off, and there's your winder for your film. You set your film in, set it up, get it started, put the back on, and off you go. And the very back, there's a little red circle where you can tell that the shutter has been tripped. I don't know if I can do that. You hear that? I just tripped the shutter. And if you look through here with no film, sure enough, I can see the red blink. There's no film in there. But when you trip the shutter, it opens the shutter, light comes in, exposes on the film, and so on. So this is actually a camera. You can't take the camera out, not like these. This is an amphibious camera. Pretty neat, huh? Built-in, beautiful built-in molded handle, and shutter release on the side. Film advance down here on the right, film, advance the film. This has a, you okay, Kev? This has a similar system for lining up the subject. So this is just backwards, a post and crosshairs, and you put the post on there and aim it at the fish, and you know you're shooting. Now this also has some interesting additions to it. This one has a flash. There's the flash. And this used those famous, we talked about them earlier, Kevin, those famous Sylvania blue dot flash bulbs that you could buy anywhere. They were pretty cheap, and you could buy them almost anywhere, and you would take those. They were pretty neat. They floated. So we would take a dozen in the water, and we just put them in a little mesh bag, and they just floated just above us already. We did. We were already back then. And divers, I think, are environmentally conscious. So even the blown ones, we always kept them in the bag. So you pop it in there. Oh, good. Flash pop, and then the bulb came out. Had a release for it on the back. Bulb popped out. Put a new bulb in. Off you go again. Isn't that pretty? Underwater photography from the 60s. the Nemrod Siluro. And this particular model, this specific model I have right here in front of me, it's not uncommon. The one like this, I don't know if they exist. This is brand spanking new in the box. There's the instructions for the flash, instructions for the camera, parts breakdown. There's the inspection tag from the factory. Everything is in there. It comes in a box. This is a display box. You see here? A display box. I had it set up as it would be displayed in a store. And inside is a box for the camera and a box for the flash. And I have a Nemrod catalog here from 1968. And I was flipping through it earlier, and there it is. There's the same camera. You can see it right there in the Nemrod camera from '68. But there's a little bit of a story with this specific camera that I'd like to share with you. Two things I want to share with you. The first, pardon me, the first is that this camera has been opened one other time. About 5 years ago, I got a phone call from a very nice gentleman. He said, I'm with the New England Whaling Society. It took me a minute to figure that out. He meant whales, you know, like whales, big animals. And he says, we're located in, and he named some small town north of New York City. And he said, we're having a special event here to raise funds for the Whaling Museum. And we're collecting gear from all around that was used in part of the history of whaling, many years ago, 50 or even 100 years ago. I said, yes, well, how can I help you? He said, well, I understand somebody told me that you might have a Nemrod Siluro camera. Yes, I do. I said, well, apparently that was a very commonly used camera on whaling ships. So I said, well, that's interesting. So how can I help? He says, well, if you're willing, we would like to have your camera in our museum on display. It'll be there for 6 months. And we will send you a special contract promising to return it in perfect shape. And it'll be insured for a reasonable amount. And we will pay for the shipping to the museum here in New York and have it shipped back to you. Well, what do you say? You're a nice young man, and I wasn't using the camera that weekend. So this has been to New York City. And I told them, just be careful with it. And they said, oh yeah. And they're museum people. I think museum people, they know how. So they actually took it out, and I said, send me a photograph. So I have a photograph that's this display of my camera in a whaling museum in this small town, the name I've forgotten now, north of New York City. It's kind of neat. So that's the one thing that's kind of neat about it. The other thing that's kind of neat about it as well, speaks to me personally, although that was pretty personal. But here is, besides all this paperwork, the catalog and the owner's manuals and the brand spanking new box, I have here the receipt. This gentleman, I won't give you his name, doesn't matter, Dr. So-and-so and so-and-so, from 105 East Street in New York City. He bought this camera. He paid $71.08 for it. And that was for the camera, and he bought something else, and he bought a bag and a book. And the book was $4. The camera was actually $50. So in total it came to $41. 1962, this camera was purchased. And it was purchased at, I was going to cover the name there, Kevin. This was purchased at Central Skin Divers in Jamaica, New York. Exactly. Now you may have, if you've been watching my Vintage Scuba, you may have heard me talk about Central Skin Divers. Right. I'm going to show you. I told you that the first fins I ever owned, 1960, I bought from Ernest Archie in Central Skin Divers, Jamaica, New York. And they used to have a full-page ad every month in Skin Diver magazine, which of course I lived on. And all stuff is in there. And they had these fantastic duck feet, UDT training, underwater demolition team for those non-military people, underwater demolition team training fins. And they were $10, $9.95. And they had, I wanted those fins. Underwater demolition. And I was going to be a frogman. I think you know some of my background. So one day I had $10, a lot of money, and I put it in an envelope and addressed it and had a copy of the ad with the little order form filled out and mailed it. I think postage end was 3 cents. It was getting pretty expensive. I mailed it off to New York City to Honest Archie. And I waited and I waited. I bit my nails, and I waited and I waited. And finally, one day, the postman showed up with this box about this big. Postmen don't do that anymore. You get a box any bigger than a cigarette pack, and you get a notice. There's a box waiting for you at the post office 14 miles away, whatever. But no, he showed up with the box. His name was Joe Galogly. my postman. I bought my first scuba unit from him. Yeah, but anyway, I got lots of stories. So anyway, he showed up with this box. I took it open, opened it up. UDT training fins. I was a frog man. Yeah, Honest Archie Central Skin Divers. Oh, by the way, I should tell you that in the envelope there was $1. Because in those days, the Canadian dollar was worth more than the American dollar. There was no tax and no shipping. Shipping was free, even to Canada. Interesting story. Central Skin Divers, special place in my heart, still exists, although they have another store, that's the last I know, a few years ago, in Manhattan as well. Apparently Honest Archie's son runs the store. Almost Honest Archie, he's called. Anyway, a little bit of personal information there. So there you go, guys. Just a little bit of information, just 2 or 3 examples of some of the production cameras from the late 50s and the early 60s that I have, and some stories about them. I hope there was something in there of some interest to you. Don't be afraid to make comments. In fact, I love the comments. It's because of the comments I keep doing this. You keep sending me comments. I keep digging in my stuff and finding neat stuff to talk to you about. I'm enjoying it as much as you. Keep them coming. Thanks very much. Alec Peirce, Vintage Scuba.